The Ancien Régime was the monarchic, aristocratic, social and political system established in the Kingdom of France from approximately the 15th century until the latter part of the 18th century, under the late Valois and Bourbon dynasties. The term is occasionally used to refer to the similar feudal social and political order of the time elsewhere in Europe. The administrative and social structures of the Ancien Régime were the result of years of state-building, legislative acts, internal conflicts and civil wars, but they remained a patchwork of local privilege and historic differences until the French Revolution ended the system. Much of the medieval political centralization of France had been lost in the Hundred Years' War, and the Valois Dynasty's attempts at re-establishing control over the scattered political centers of the country were hindered by the wars of religion. Much of the reigns of Henry IV, Louis XIII, and the early years of Louis XIV were focused on administrative centralization, despite, however, the notion of absolute monarchy, and the efforts by the kings to create a centralized state. Ancien Régime France remained a country of systemic irregularities. Administrative, legal, judicial, and ecclesiastic divisions and prerogatives frequently overlapped, while the French nobility struggled to maintain their own rights in the matters of local government and justice, and powerful internal conflicts protested against this centralization. The need for centralization in this period was directly linked to the question of royal finances and the ability to wage war. The internal conflicts and dynastic crises of the 16th and 17th centuries and the territorial expansion of France in the 17th century demanded great sums which needed to be raised through taxes, such as the taille and the gabelle, by contributions of men and service from the nobility. One key to this centralization was the replacing of personal clientele systems organized around the king and other nobles by institutional systems around the state. The creation of the intendants, representatives of royal power in the provinces, did much to undermine local control by regional nobles. The same was true of the greater reliance shown by the royal court on the noblesse à robe as judges and royal councillors. The creation of regional parliaments had initially the same goal of facilitating the introduction of royal power into newly assimilated territories. But as the parliaments gained in self-assurance, they began to be sources of disunity. Terminology. The term in French means «old régime» or «former régime». However, most English-language books use the French term «Ancien Régime». The term first appeared in print in English in 1794, and was originally pejorative in nature. Simon Schama has observed, virtually as soon as the term was coined, «old régime» was automatically freighted with associations of both traditionalism and senescence. It conjured up a society so encrusted with anachronisms that only a shock of great violence could free the living organism within. Institutionally torpid, economically immobile, culturally atrophied and socially stratified, this old regime was incapable of self-modernization. More generally, Ancien Régime refers to any political and social system having the principal features of the French Ancien Régime. Europe's other ancient regime had similar origins, but diverse fates. Some eventually evolved into constitutional monarchies, whereas others were torn down by wars and revolutions, provinces and administrative divisions. Territorial expansion. In the mid-15th century, France was significantly smaller than it is today, and numerous border provinces were either autonomous or belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. The Crown of Aragon and the Kingdom of Navarre were also foreign enclaves, like the Comtat Venaissin. In addition, certain provinces within France were ostensibly personal fiefs of noble families. For the late 15th century up to the late 17th century, France underwent a massive territorial expansion and an attempt to better integrate its provinces into an administrative whole. French acquisitions from 1461 to 1768, under Louis XI, Provence, Dauphiné; under Louis XII, Milan, Naples; under Francis I, Brittany; under Henry II, de facto Trois-Évêchés, Calais; under Henry IV, County of Foix; under Louis XIII, Bearn and Navarre; under Louis XIV, Treaty of Westphalia, Alsace and de jure Trois-Évêchés; Treaty of the Pyrenees, Artois, Northern Catalonia; Treaty of Nijmegen, Franche-Comté, Flanders; under Louis XV, Lorraine, Corsica. Administration. Despite efforts by the kings to create a centralized state out of these provinces, France in this period remained a patchwork of local privileges and historical differences. The arbitrary power of the monarch was in fact much limited by historic and regional particularities. Administrative, legal, judicial, and ecclesiastic divisions and prerogatives frequently overlapped. Certain provinces and cities had won special privileges. The south of France was governed by written law adapted from the Roman legal system, the north of France by common law. The representative of the king in his provinces and cities was the governor. Royal offices chosen from the highest nobility. Provincial and city governors were predominantly military positions in charge of defense and policing. Provincial governors, also called lieutenants généraux, also had the ability of convoking provincial parliaments, provincial estates and municipal bodies. The title governor first appeared under Charles VI. The Ordinance of Blois of 1579 reduced the number to 12, and an ordinance of 1779 increased the number to 39. Although in principle they were the king's representatives and the charges could be revoked at the king's will, some governors had installed themselves and their heirs as a provincial dynasty. The governors were at the height of the power from the middle of the 16th to the mid-17th century. The role in provincial unrest during the civil wars led Cardinal Richelieu to create the more tractable positions of intendants of finance, policing and justice, and in the 18th century the role of provincial governors was greatly curtailed. In an attempt to reform the system, new divisions were created. Aristocrates généraux, commonly known as généralités, were initially only taxation districts. The first 16 were created in 1542 by edict of Henry II. Their role steadily increased, and by the mid-17th century, the généralités were under the authority of an intendant, and they became a vehicle for the expansion of royal power in matters of justice, taxation and policing. By the Revolution, there were 36 généralités. The last two were created in 1784. State finances. The desire for more efficient tax collection was one of the major causes for French administrative and royal centralization in the early modern period. The taille became a major source of royal income. Exempted from the taille were clergy and nobles, officers of the crown, military personnel, magistrates, university professors and students, and certain cities such as Paris. The provinces were of three sorts: the pays d'election, the pays d'equité, and the pays d'imposition. In the pays d'election, the assessment and collection of taxes were trusted to elected officials, and the tax was generally personal, meaning it was attached to non-noble individuals. In the pays d'equité, Brittany, Languedoc, Burgundy, Auvergne, Bearn, Dauphiné, Provence and portions of Gascony, such as Bigorre, Comminges and the Quatre Valais, recently acquired provinces which had been able to maintain a certain local autonomy in terms of taxation. The assessment of the tax was established by local councils, and the tax was generally real, meaning that it was attached to non-noble lands. Pays d'imposition were recently conquered lands which had their own local historical institutions, although taxation was overseen by the royal intendant. Taxation history. Taxation districts had gone through a variety of mutations from the 14th century on. Before the 14th century, oversight of the collection of royal taxes fell generally to the bailiffs and seneschaux in the circumscriptions. Reforms in the 14th and 15th centuries saw France's royal financial administration run by two financial boards which worked in a collegial manner. The Généraux des Finances oversaw the collection of taxes by tax-collecting agents, and the Trésoriers de France oversaw revenues from royal lands. Together they were the Messieurs des Finances. The four members of each board were divided by geographical circumscriptions. The areas were named Languedoc, Languedoc, Outre-Seine, Yonne and Normandy, with the directors of the Languedoc region typically having an honorific preeminence. By 1484, the number of généralités had increased to 6. In the 16th century, the kings of France, in an effort to exert more direct control over royal finances and to circumvent the double board, instituted numerous administrative reforms, including the restructuring of the financial administration and an increase in the number of généralités. In 1542, Henry II, France was divided into 16 généralités. The number increased to 21 at the end of the 16th century, and to 36 at the time of the French Revolution. The last two were created in 1784. The administration of the Généralité of the Renaissance went through a variety of reforms. In 1577, Henry III established 5 treasurers in each Généralité who formed a Bureau of Finances. In the 17th century, oversight of the Généralité was subsumed by the intendants of finance, justice and police, and the expression Généralité and intendants became roughly synonymous. Until the late 17th century, tax collectors were called receveurs. In 1680, the system of the firm générale was established, a franchised customs and excise operation in which individuals bought the right to collect the taille on behalf of the king, through 6 years adjudications. The major tax collectors in that system were known as the fermiers généraux. The taille was only one of a number of taxes. There also existed the taille, a national salt tax, national tariffs on various products, local tariffs on specialty products levied on products entering the city as sold at fairs, and local taxes. Finally, the church benefited from a mandatory tax or tithe called the dime. Louis XIV created several additional tax systems, including the capitation, which touched every person including nobles and the clergy, and the dixume, enacted to support the military, which was a true tax on income and on property value. In 1749, under Louis XV, a new tax based on the dixume, the vingtieme, was enacted to reduce the royal deficit, and this tax continued through the remaining years of the Ancien Régime. Fees for holding state positions. Another key source of state financing was through charging fees for state positions. Many of these fees were quite elevated, but some of these offices conferred nobility and could be financially advantageous. The use of officers to seek profit had become standard practice as early as the 12th and 13th centuries. A law in 1467 made these officers irrevocable, except through the death, resignation or forfeiture of the title holder, and these officers, once bought, tended to become hereditary charges passed on within families. In an effort to increase revenues, the state often turned to the creation of new officers. Before it was made illegal in 1521, it had been possible to leave open-ended the date that the transfer of title was to take effect. In 1534, the 40 days rule was instituted, which made the successor's right void if the preceding office holder died within 40 days of the transfer and the office returned to the state. However, a new fiat called the survivance joasante protected against the 40 days rule. In 1604, Sully created a new tax, the paulet, or annual tax, which permitted the title holder to be free of the 40-day rule. The paulet and the venality of officers became key concerns in the parliamentarian revolts of the 1640s. The state also demanded of the church a free gift, which the church collected from holders of ecclesiastic offices through taxes called the deacutime. State finances also relied heavily on borrowing, both private and public. The most important public source for borrowing was through the system of rentes sur or Hôtel de Ville of Paris, a kind of government bond system offering investors annual interest. This system first came to use in 1522 under Francis I. Until 1661, the head of the financial system in France was generally the Surintendant des Finances. In that year, the Surintendant Nicolas Fouquet fell from power and the position was replaced by the less powerful Contrôleur Général des Finances. Justice. Lower courts justice in seigneurial lands was generally overseen by the seigneur or his delegated officers. Since the 15th century, much of the seigneur's legal purview had been given to the bailliages of sénéchaussées and the présidiaux, leaving only affairs concerning seigneurial dues and duties, and small affairs of local justice. Only certain seigneurs, those with the power of haute justice, could enact the death penalty, and only with the consent of the présidiaux. Crimes of desertion, highway robbery, and mendicants were under the supervision of the prévôt des maréchaux, who exacted quick and impartial justice. In 1670, the purview was overseen by the présidiaux. The national judicial system was made up of tribunals divided into bailliages and sénéchaussées. These tribunals were supervised by a lieutenant general and were subdivided into prévôtés supervised by a prévôt, or into vicomtes supervised by a vicomte, or into châtellenies supervised by a châtelaine, or, in the south, into vigueries of bailies supervised by a viguier or a bail. In an effort to reduce the caseload in the parliaments, certain bailliages were given extended powers by Henry II of France. These were called présidiaux. The prévôts or their equivalent were the first-level judges for non-nobles and ecclesiastics. In the exercise of the legal functions, they sat alone, but had to consult with certain lawyers chosen by themselves, whom, to use the technical phrase, they summoned to the council. The appeals from the sentences went to the bailliages, who also had jurisdiction in the first instance over actions brought against nobles. Bailliages and présidiaux were also the first court for certain crimes: sacrilege, lèse-majesté, kidnapping, rape, heresy, alteration of money, sedition, insurrections, and the illegal carrying of arms. To appeal a bailliage's decisions, one turned to the regional parliaments. The most important of these royal tribunals was the prévôté and présidial of Paris, the Châtelet, which was overseen by the prévôt of Paris, civil and criminal lieutenants, and a royal officer in charge of maintaining public order in the capital, the Lieutenant General of Police of Paris. Superior courts. The following were cours souverains, or superior courts, whose decisions could only be revoked by the king in his conseil. Parliaments, eventually 14 in number: Paris, Languedoc, Provence, Franche-Comté, Guyenne, Burgundy, Flanders, Dauphiné, Trois-Évêchés, Lorraine, Navarre, Brittany, Normandy and Ombes. There was also Parliament in Savoy from 1537 to 59. The parliaments were originally only judicial in nature, but began to subsume limited legislative functions. The most important of the parliaments, both in administrative area and prestige, was the Parliament of Paris, which also was the court of first instance for peers of the realm and for regalian affairs. Conseils souverains, Alsace-Roussillon, Artois and Corsica, formerly Flanders, Navarre and Lorraine. The conseils souverains were regional parliaments in recently conquered lands. Chamber des Comptes, Paris, Dijon, Blois, Grenoble, Nantes. The Chamber des Comptes supervised the spending of public funds, the protection of royal lands, and legal issues involving these areas. Cours des Aides, Paris, Clermont, Bordeaux, Montauban. The Cours des Aides supervised affairs in the pays d'élections, often concerning taxes on wine, beer, soap, oil, metals, etc. Chamber des Comptes combined with Cours des Aides, Aix-Bar-le-Duc, Dole, Nancy, Montpellier, Pau, Rouen. Cours des Mines, Paris, additionally Lyon, and the Chamber des Comptes of Bar-le-Duc and Nancy. The Cours des Mines oversaw money, coins and precious metals. Grand Conseil, created in 1497 to oversee affairs concerning ecclesiastical benefices. Occasionally the king sought the Grand Conseil's intervention in affairs considered to be too contentious for the Parliament. The head of the judicial system in France was the Chancellor Administration. One of the established principles of the French monarchy was that the king could not act without the advice of his council. The formula Loi en son conseil expressed this deliberative aspect. The administration of the French state in the early modern period went through a long evolution. As a truly administrative apparatus relying on old nobility, newer chancellor nobility and administrative professionals was substituted to the feudal clientele system. King's Council. Under Charles VIII and Louis XII, the King's Council was dominated by members of 20th and nobler rich families. Under Francis I, the number of councillors increased to roughly 70 individuals. The most important positions in the court were those of the great officers of the Crown of France, headed by the Connétable and the Chancellor. The royal administration during the Renaissance was divided between a small council of 6 or fewer members for important matters of state, and a larger council for judicial or financial affairs. Francis I was sometimes criticized for relying too heavily on a small number of advisers, while Henry II, Catherine de' Medici and the sons found themselves frequently unable to negotiate between the opposing Guise and Montmorency families in their council. Over time, the decision-making apparatus of the King's Council was divided into several royal councils. The sub-councils of the King's Council can be generally grouped as governmental councils, financial councils, and judicial and administrative councils. With the names and subdivisions of the 17th–18th century, these sub-councils were governmental councils. Conseil d'État, composed of the king, the crown prince, the chancellor, the contrôleur général des finances, and the secretary of state in charge of foreign affairs. Conseil des Députés, composed of the king, the chancellor, the secretaries of state, the contrôleur général des finances, and other councillors according to the issues discussed. Conseil de conscience. Financial councils. Conseil royal des finances, composed of the king, the chef du conseil des finances, the chancellor, the contrôleur général des finances and 2 of his councillors, and the intendants of finance. Conseil royal de commerce. Judicial and administrative councils. Conseil d'État des finances or Conseil ordinaire des finances. By the late 17th century, its functions were largely taken over by the 3 following sections. Conseil privé, Conseil des parties or Conseil d'État, the largest of the royal councils, composed of the chancellor, the dukes with peerage, the ministers and secretaries of state, the
Contrôleur Général des Finances, the 30 Councillors of State, the 80 Maîtres des Requêtes and the Intendants of Finance. Grande Direction des Finances, Petite Direction des Finances. In addition to the above administrative institutions, the king was also surrounded by an extensive personal and court retinue, regrouped under the name Maison du Roi. At the death of Louis XIV, the regent Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, abandoned several of the above administrative structures, most notably the Secretaries of State, which were replaced by councils. This system of government, called the polysynody, lasted from 1715 to 18. 17th-century state positions. Under Henry IV and Louis XIII, the administrative apparatus of the court and its councils was expanded and the proportion of the noblesse de robe increased, culminating in the following positions during the 17th century. First Minister, ministers and secretaries of state, such as Sully, Concini, Richelieu, Mazarin, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Cardinal de Fleury, Turgot, etc., exerted a powerful control over state administration in the 17th and 18th century. The title, Principal Ministre de l'Equité, was however only given 6 times in this period, and Louis XIV himself refused to choose a prime minister. After the death of Mazarin, Chancellor of France, Controller General of Finances, Secretaries of State, created in 1547 by Henry II, of greater importance after 1588, generally 4 in number, but occasionally 5, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State for War, also oversaw France's border provinces. Secretary of State of the Navy, Secretary of State of the Maison du Roi, who also oversaw the clergy, the affairs of Paris and the non-border provinces, Secretary of State for Protestant affairs, Councillors of State, Maîtres des Requêtes, Intendants of Finance, Intendants of Commerce, Ministers of State, Treasurers, Farmers General, Superintendent of the Postal System, Directeur Général of Buildings, Directeur Général of Fortifications, Lieutenant General of Police of Paris, Archbishop of Paris, Royal Confessor. Royal administration in the provinces had been the role of the bailliages and sénéchaussées in the Middle Ages, but this declined in the early modern period, and by the end of the 18th century, the bailliages served only a judicial function. The main source of royal administrative power in the provinces in the 16th and early 17th centuries fell to the gouverneurs, positions which had long been held by only the highest-ranked families in the realm. With the civil wars of the early modern period, the king increasingly turned to more tractable and subservient emissaries, and this was the reason for the growth of the provincial intendants under Louis XIII and Louis XIV. Intendants were chosen from among the Maîtres des Requêtes. Intendants attached to a province had jurisdiction over finances, justice and policing. By the 18th century, royal administrative power was firmly established in the provinces, despite protestations by local parliaments. In addition to the role as appellate courts, regional parliaments had gained the privilege to register the edicts of the king and to present the king with official complaints concerning the edicts. In this way, they had acquired a limited role as the representative voice of the magistrate class. In case of refusal on Parliament's part to register the edicts, the king could impose registration through a royal assize. The other traditional representatives bodies in the realm were the Etats Généraux, which reunited the 3 estates of the realm, and the Etats Provinciaux,
The Etats Generaux had been reunited in times of fiscal crisis convoked by parties malcontent with royal prerogatives, but they had no true power. The dissensions between the three orders rendered them weak and they were dissolved before having completed their work. As a sign of French absolutism, they ceased to be convoked from 1614 to 1789. The provincial estates proved more effective, and were convoked by the king to respond to fiscal and tax policies.